1889. 1977. Same river, same mud, same unexpected disaster. 88 years apart. 2 walls of water, 2 valleys full of people who had no warning. 2 investigations, 2 sets of reports filed, stamped and archived. And between them, a gap. Not a gap in time, a gap in memory. Somebody removed the file. Blackwell here, and this is the story of a valley that drowned twice. Not because the river was unpredictable, not because the engineering was primitive, but because someone decided that the first drowning was bad for business and made it disappear. The place is called Johnstown. It sits in a narrow valley in western Pennsylvania where the little Conemaugh River bends through the Allegheny Mountains. The geography matters. Everything about this story starts with the shape of the land. A river at the bottom, mountains on both sides, and 14 miles upstream, a lake. Not a natural lake, a reservoir, held in place by a dam. The South Fork Dam was built in 1852 by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania as part of a canal system. It was a significant piece of infrastructure for its time. 62 feet high, 931 feet across. It held back 20 million tons of water in a lake that covered over 400 acres. Lake Conemaugh, a body of water sitting 700 feet above the town of Johnstown. When the canal system became obsolete, the state sold the dam. It changed hands several times. Maintenance declined. By the 1870s, the dam had already been partially breached once, patched, and left in uncertain condition. Nobody with the authority to act seemed particularly concerned. Then, in 1879, a group of wealthy industrialists from Pittsburgh purchased the property. They called themselves the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The membership list read like a directory of American capitalism. Andrew Carnegie, Henry Clay Frick, Andrew Mellon. 61 members. They wanted a private retreat in the mountains. They wanted a lake for fishing. What they did not want was the expense of maintaining the dam properly. The club lowered the dam's crest to widen the road across the top so carriages could pass. They installed fish screens in the spillway, metal grates to keep their stocked bass from escaping downstream. The screens caught debris. The spillway, which was the dam's safety valve, its single mechanism for releasing excess water, began to clog. An engineer named Daniel Morrell, who managed the Cambria Iron Company down in Johnstown, wrote to the club. He warned them. He asked for an inspection. He was polite about it. He was specific. He was ignored. That was 1880, 9 years before the flood. Daniel Morrell would be dead by the time the water came. He never saw the consequences of the letter nobody read. But the letter existed. The warning was on record. On May 31st, 1889, after days of heavy rain, the lake rose. The spillway, clogged with debris and narrowed by years of neglect, could not handle the volume. Water topped the dam. The earthen structure, weakened by decades of deferred maintenance, began to erode. At approximately 3:10 in the afternoon, the South Fork Dam failed completely. 20 million tons of water dropped into the valley. The wall of water was roughly 60 feet high and moved at approximately 40 miles per hour. It reached Johnstown in under an hour, carrying trees, houses, railroad cars, barbed wire from a destroyed factory upstream, and an uncountable volume of mud and stone. The flood hit the stone bridge at the edge of town, where wreckage piled up and caught fire. People trapped in the debris burned. The official count was 2,209 dead. Some estimates run higher. 99 entire families were erased. Bodies were found as far away as Cincinnati, carried downstream over the following weeks and months. A 7-year-old girl's remains were discovered 350 miles from Johnstown. The South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club was sued. The case went to court. The club's lawyers argued that the flood was an act of God, unprecedented rainfall, unforeseeable conditions. The court agreed. No member of the club paid a single dollar in damages. Andrew Carnegie donated money to build a library. The town rebuilt itself on the same valley floor. That was 1889. The disaster was one of the worst in American history at the time. It made international headlines. Queen Victoria sent a personal message of condolence. Clara Barton and the American Red Cross mounted their first major disaster relief operation. Everyone knew about Johnstown. Everyone. For a while. The critical thing about what happened next is not the flood itself. It is what happened to the documentation of the flood. After the disaster, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania commissioned surveys, geological assessments of the valley, hydrological studies of the watershed, engineering reports on the dam failure, soil analyses, flood maps showing inundation zones, the kind of technical documentation that exists specifically to prevent the same thing from happening again. These documents were filed. They were public record. They sat in the county archives and in the State Geological Survey. Blackwell went looking for them. Not in a library, in the actual registry. The Cambria County Land Records, the state archives, the places where these documents should have been sitting for over a century, available to anyone who needed them. Any engineer, any developer, any county official assessing whether it was safe to build in the valley. The documents were not there, not destroyed, not lost in a fire, not misplaced. They had been transferred, moved from the active county records to a facility that, in archival terminology, is called a dead archive. A storage location for documents that are technically preserved but practically inaccessible. Not indexed in the county's active catalogue. Not referenced in the standard search systems that an engineer or developer would use when pulling records on a site. The transfer happened in 1923. That date matters. Blackwell pulled the transfer paperwork. It was a standard administrative form, a request to relocate historical documents from the Cambria County active records to an off-site storage facility managed by the state. The form listed the documents: geological surveys, post-flood assessments, hydrological maps, engineering reports related to the South Fork Dam failure of 1889. 27 documents in total, bundled together, moved together on the same date. The obvious first question was why? Documents do get moved. Archives reorganize. Old records make way for new ones. County offices run out of filing cabinets. There are 100 mundane reasons why a batch of 34-year-old geological surveys might be transferred to deep storage. Bureaucratic housekeeping. Nothing sinister, just paperwork. That was the first version Blackwell tested, the boring version, the version that says, this was routine, nobody planned anything. Filing cabinets filled up, somebody made a decision, and old flood records went to the basement. It happens. It is not interesting. Except for the timing. In 1924, 1 year after the documents were moved, a development company called Allegheny Valley Land Associates purchased a significant tract of land in the Connemore Valley. The same valley, the same floodplain, the land that had been underwater in 1889, the land that the now inaccessible geological surveys had specifically identified as a high-risk inundation zone. Allegheny Valley Land Associates planned residential development, houses, streets, infrastructure, a community built on the valley floor, downstream from the same watershed, along the same river, in the same geographic funnel that had concentrated 20 million tons of water into a 60-foot wall less than 4 decades earlier. To develop the land, they needed permits. To get permits, They needed geological assessments. And when the engineers hired by the county pulled the records on that parcel of land, they found nothing. Clean data, no flood history, no geological warnings, no inundation maps. The 1889 disaster, as far as the accessible public record was concerned, had not happened. At this point in the investigation, there was a second version to consider. The version that says, coincidence. The documents were moved for routine reasons. The development company got lucky. The engineers did their due diligence, found nothing alarming, and proceeded in good faith. Two events, the archival transfer and the land purchase, happened to occur in sequence without any causal connection. Blackwell tested this version too. It held up for about 48 hours. Then the transfer form provided the answer. The form that authorized the relocation of those 27 documents from the Cambria County active records to the dead archive bore a signature. A county official named Harold Euston Gifford. Gifford served as the Cambria County Records Supervisor from 1919 to 1931. He had the authority to approve archival transfers. His signature on the form was unremarkable. Bureaucrats sign forms. That is what they do. What was remarkable was where else Gifford's name appeared. Allegheny Valley Land Associates filed its articles of incorporation with the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in March of 1923. The same year the documents were moved. The filing listed the company's initial board of directors. 5 names. The third name on the list was Harold E. Gifford. The county records supervisor who signed the order to move 27 critical flood documents to inaccessible storage was simultaneously a board member of the company that would purchase the land those documents pertained to 1 year later. The documents were moved in September of 1923. The land purchase closed in April of 1924, 7 months apart. Gifford's name is on both. Now, it is worth stating clearly what this does and does not prove. There is no surviving memo from Gifford saying, "Move these files so we can buy the land." No letter between board members discussing the archival transfer. No confession. The connection is circumstantial. A signature on a transfer form. A name on a corporate filing. A 7-month gap. A set of documents that ended up exactly where they would be most difficult to find, at exactly the moment when finding them would have been most inconvenient for a real estate transaction. Blackwell is not a court. This is not a verdict, but circumstantial evidence is still evidence, and the pattern is not subtle. The development proceeded. Houses were built in the valley, families moved in, the community grew. By the 1950s, the Connemore Valley had a population of several thousand people, living on land that geological surveys now sitting in a storage facility nobody checked, had identified as a catastrophic flood zone. And the dam. There was a new dam. Not the South Fork Dam, which had been destroyed in 1889 and never rebuilt. A different dam, upstream on a tributary, built by the county in the 1930s as part of a flood control program. A program that would have been informed by the geological history of the watershed, if the geological history had been in the files the engineers consulted. It was not. The new dam was designed based on available data. The available data did not include the 1889 flood. The engineering was sound for the conditions the engineers believed existed. The problem was not the engineering. The problem was the information the engineers were given. The engineers were handed a valley with no flood history. They designed for a valley with no flood history. They were not incompetent. They were not negligent. They were working with a lie. Decades passed. The dam held. The community grew. The valley filled with houses, schools, businesses, roads. People lived their entire lives on that valley floor without knowing what had happened there in 1889. Not because the information was secret, it was public record, technically, but because it was unreachable, buried in a dead archive. Disconnected from every index, every catalogue, every search path that a normal person or a normal engineer would follow. The name Johnstown still appeared in history books, of course. The 1889 flood was famous. It was taught in schools. But there is a difference between knowing that a flood happened somewhere and having the technical documentation that shows exactly which parcels of land were underwater, exactly which geological conditions made the valley dangerous, exactly which elevations were within the inundation zone. The history books told you that Johnstown flooded. The documents in the dead archive told you which specific houses were built on ground that should never have been developed. One is a story, the other is a warning. The story survived. The warning was filed away. On July 19, 1977, a slow-moving storm system stalled over the Conemaugh Valley. Between 7 and 12 inches of rain fell in less than 10 hours. The tributaries swelled. The dam, the new dam, the one built with clean data, exceeded its capacity. The spillway was overwhelmed. Water overtopped the structure. The sequence was familiar. Rain, a failing dam, water channeling through the narrow valley, a wall of debris moving downstream toward a population that had no warning and no evacuation plan. Because the evacuation plan, like the dam design, was based on the available data. And the available data said the valley was safe. The 1977 Johnstown flood took 84 lives. It destroyed hundreds of homes. The damage exceeded $300 million. President Carter declared it a federal disaster area. The National Guard was deployed. The Red Cross returned to Johnstown for the second time in less than a century. 84 people, not 2,209. The 1977 flood was smaller. The dam was smaller. The rainfall was less extreme. But the mechanism was identical. Water, valley, dam, failure. No warning. The same geography, the same physics. The same outcome, scaled down but structurally indistinguishable from 1889. And the investigation that followed turned up something that should have been impossible. Federal engineers examining the 1977 failure asked a straightforward question. What was the flood history of the watershed? They pulled the county records. They found nothing predating the 1930s. They found the design specifications for the dam that had just failed. They found the geological assessments that had been used to justify the dam's construction. All clean, all incomplete, all missing the single most relevant piece of information, that this exact valley had experienced one of the most catastrophic dam failures in American history 88 years earlier. When the federal investigators expanded their search beyond the county's active records, they found the dead archive. They found the 27 documents. They found the geological surveys, the hydrological maps, the post-flood assessments from 1889. Everything that should have informed the design of the new dam. Everything that should have prevented houses from being built on the valley floor. Everything that had been moved in 1923 by a county official who sat on the board of the company that bought the land. The investigators' report noted the discrepancy. It noted that critical historical data had been absent from the active record at the time the dam was designed. It noted that this absence materially affected the design parameters. It did not, as far as the public record shows, pursue the question of why the data was absent. The report focused on engineering failures and emergency response. The archival question was mentioned. It was not investigated. Harold Gifford died in 1949. He was never questioned about the transfer. Allegheny Valley Land Associates was dissolved in 1961. Its records, with a symmetry that Blackwell finds difficult to describe as accidental, were also transferred to deep storage upon dissolution. The company's internal correspondence, board minutes, and financial records are technically preserved. They are practically inaccessible. The pattern repeats. So here is what Blackwell can say with certainty, and here is where the certainty ends. With certainty, the 1889 flood was exhaustively documented. Those documents were moved from accessible public records to inaccessible storage in 1923. The person who authorized the move was simultaneously a board member of a company that purchased the affected land in 1924. The subsequent dam was designed without the historical data. The dam failed in 1977 in a manner consistent with the 1889 failure. 84 people died. Without certainty, whether Gifford moved the documents specifically to facilitate the land sale, whether other board members knew, whether the engineers who designed the 1977 dam would have changed their design if they had seen the 1889 data, whether 84 deaths could have been prevented by 27 documents in the right filing cabinet. The uncertainty is real, but so is this. The documents were in the wrong place, at the right time, for the right people. What strikes Blackwell about this story is not the corruption. Corruption is ordinary. A county official with a financial interest in a land deal, that is Tuesday. It is not interesting. What is interesting is the mechanism, the method, the weapon. Harold Gifford did not burn the documents. He did not shred them. He did not throw them in the river. He filed them. He moved them from one archive to another, from active to dead, from findable to technically still there but good luck. He did not destroy the past. He just made it very, very difficult to reach. And that is a more elegant destruction than fire. Fire leaves ash. Fire leaves absence. When a document is burned, someone eventually asks, "Where is the document?" But when a document is transferred, when it is still preserved, still technically public, still sitting in a box in a warehouse somewhere, nobody asks. The document exists, it is just somewhere else. And in the gap between existing and being found, you can build a neighborhood. You can sell lots. You can watch families move in. You can collect decades of property tax on land that a buried geological survey says should be underwater. This is the lesson Blackwell keeps returning to. Not that powerful people do terrible things. That is not news. The lesson is about the filing cabinet. The lesson is about the form with the signature. The lesson is about the dead archive. We think of disasters as failures of engineering, failures of materials, failures of physics. The concrete cracked, the steel corroded, the water rose higher than the model predicted. And sometimes that is true. Sometimes the math was wrong. Sometimes the materials were flawed. Sometimes nature exceeds every reasonable expectation. But sometimes the math was right. The materials were sound. The engineering was competent. And the disaster happened anyway, because the engineer was given a lie dressed up as data. Because someone, decades earlier, signed a form and moved a file, and created a gap in the record that would, years later, become a gap in a dam wall, that would become a gap in a community, that would become 84 empty chairs at 84 dinner tables. The river does not care about filing cabinets. The river does not consult the county records. The river remembers what it did in 1889 because the river is water, and water follows gravity, and gravity does not lose paperwork. But we do. We lose paperwork. Or we move it. Or we file it somewhere that requires 3 written requests, a notarized authorization, and 6 to 8 weeks of processing time. And then we build on the floodplain and call it progress, and act surprised when the water comes back. The Connemore Valley is still there. Johnstown is still there. People still live on the valley floor. The geological data is now, finally, in the accessible record. The 1889 flood and the 1977 flood are both documented, both indexed, both findable by anyone who looks. But Blackwell wonders sometimes how many other valleys have their own dead archives. How many other Harold Giffords signed how many other transfer forms? How many other filing cabinets hold how many other warnings that nobody will find until the water is already in the streets? There are approximately 91,000 dams in the United States. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives the national dam infrastructure a grade of D. Not C, not B, D. Over 15,000 dams are classified as high hazard, meaning their failure would cause loss of life. The average age of an American dam is 57 years. Many were designed for a 50-year lifespan. How many of them were designed with complete data? How many of the geological surveys are in the active file? How many are in the dead archive? Blackwell does not have the answer. Blackwell is not sure anyone does. The river is still there. The mud is still there. The files are still missing. That is the cost of deleting history. Not a cover-up, not a conspiracy, just a signature on a form. Just a box moved from one shelf to another. Just a gap that looks like nothing until the rain starts. Next time, Blackwell is going to talk about a woman named Mary Mallon. Most people know her as Typhoid Mary. She was a cook. She carried a disease. She knew she carried it, and she never stopped cooking. Not because she was evil, because nobody with authority gave her a single viable alternative. From a flood of water to a flood of disease, and in both cases, someone had the file. Someone chose not to open it. The parallel is worth sitting with for a moment. In Johnstown, the information existed. It was public. It was documented. It was filed, stamped, catalogued and stored. And then it was moved, not destroyed, just relocated, to a place where the people who needed it most would never think to look. The result was not ignorance. Ignorance implies the information never existed. This was something else. This was engineered inaccessibility. The difference between not knowing and not being allowed to easily know. And that distinction matters because it changes who bears responsibility. If an engineer builds a dam without flood data because no flood data exists, that is tragedy. If an engineer builds a dam without flood data because the flood data was moved to a warehouse in another county by a man with a financial interest in the land below, that is something else entirely. The engineer is still not at fault. The dam is still not at fault. The rain is still not at fault. But someone is. I had never finally to find, and what should be difficult. Every index is a set of priorities. Every catalogue is an argument about what matters. When a document is in the active file, it speaks. It informs every decision made about the land it describes, the structure it assesses, the risk it identifies. When that same document is in the dead archive, it is silent. Not gone, silent. And silence, in a filing system, is indistinguishable from absence. An engineer pulling records on a site will find what the system offers. If the system offers nothing, the engineer proceeds with nothing. The system decided. The engineer followed the system. The water followed the gravity, and the chairs at the dinner table stayed empty. 84 chairs. That is not a large number in the arithmetic of disasters. The 1889 flood took 26 times as many lives. The 1977 flood was, by comparison, a footnote, a regional tragedy, not a national catastrophe, not a name that schoolchildren learn, not a line in every history textbook. But 84 is not an abstraction to Blackwell. 84 is a number that could have been 0. Not through better engineering, not through better weather forecasting, not through stronger concrete or higher walls or faster emergency response, through a filing cabinet. threw 27 documents in the right place instead of the wrong one, through a county records supervisor who did not sit on a real estate board. That is what makes this story difficult to put down, not the scale, the preventability, the sheer mundane specificity of the cause, not a crack in a dam wall, a signature on a transfer form, not a force of nature, a force of paperwork. And the paperwork is still out there. That is the part that keeps Blackwell up at night, not the Johnstown paperwork specifically that has been recovered, re-indexed, restored to the active record. The lesson has been learned for that particular valley, for those particular documents, for that particular river. 90 years late, but learned. The question is about all the other paperwork, the transfers that have not been discovered, the dead archives that have not been audited, the geological surveys sitting in warehouses in counties where someone, 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, had a reason to make a piece of land look safer than it was. Blackwell cannot audit every county archive in the country. Nobody can. The system is too large, too fragmented, too dependent on the integrity of individual officials in individual offices in individual counties. There is no national index of geological risk data. There is no central repository where every flood survey, every soil analysis, every hydrological assessment is stored and cross-referenced and made permanently accessible. There is instead a patchwork, thousands of local archives, each with its own filing system, each with its own budget, each with its own definition of what active and dead mean. And in that patchwork, in the gaps between systems, in the seams between jurisdictions, the Harold Giffords of the world operate. Not with dynamite, not with matches, with forms and signatures and the quiet authority to decide what goes on which shelf. The river does not care about jurisdiction. The river does not respect the boundary between Cambria County and Somerset County. The river goes where gravity sends it, carrying whatever it picks up along the way: mud, trees, houses, history. The river is the one record that cannot be transferred to a dead archive. The river remembers everything. The river is the geological survey that nobody can move. Johnstown sits in its valley. The Conemaugh runs through it. The mountains stand on both sides. The geography has not changed since 1889, has not changed since 1977, will not change tomorrow or next year or in another 88 years. The shape of the land is the shape of the risk. That was true before the first dam was built. It was true when Harold Gifford signed the form. It is true now. And somewhere, in some county, in some state, there is a box on a shelf in a warehouse. Inside the box is a folder. Inside the folder is a survey. The survey says, "Do not build here. The water will come. The valley will flood. The dam will fail. Here are the numbers. Here is the math. Here are the contour lines showing exactly which houses will be underwater." The box is in the dead archive. The folder has not been opened in decades. The survey is technically public record. It is technically accessible. It technically exists. Technically. The river is still there. The mud is still there. The files are still missing.